Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, and Happy New Year! New Year, new series. Today we begin reading the book The Shepherd of the Hills, written by Harold Bell Wright and published in 1907. So pushing on, 120 years almost. 119 years ago it was written. Darn near hot off the press. Anyway, we'll read the introduction today and then we'll get to chapter 1 next week. I hope you'll enjoy this book. The Two Trails. This is my story. It is a very old story. In the hills of life there are two trails. One lies along the higher sunlit fields where those who journey see afar, and the light lingers even when the sun is down. And one leads to the lower ground where those who travel as they go look always over their shoulders with eyes of dread, and gloomy shadows gather long before the day is done. This, my story, is the story of a man who took the trail that leads to the lower ground, and of a woman and how she found her way to the higher sunlit fields. In the story, it all happened in the Ozark Mountains, many miles from what we of the city call civilization. In life, it has all happened many, many times before, in many, many places. The two trails lead afar. The story, so very old, is still in the telling. Preachin' Bill, who runs the ferry, says, quote, "When God looked down upon the work of his hands and called hit good, he were sure a-looking at this here Ozark country. Rough? Law, yes. Hit were made that way on purpose. Ain't nothing to a flat country nohow. A man just naturally wear himself plumb out a-walking on a level ground. There ain't no hill to spell 'em. And then look how much more there is of it. Take 40 acres of flat land and hit's just 40. But you take 40 acres of this here Ozark country, and God Almighty only knows how much it would be if it were rolled out flat. 'Tain't no wonder at all God rested when he made these here hills. He just naturally had to quit, for he done his beatin'est and wore plumb gin out." Of all the country Bill had seen, from Ain't Creek Head to the mouth of the James, and plumb to Pilot Knob, he "'lowed that Mutton Hollow neighborhood was the purtiest." From the Matthews place on the ridge that shuts in the valley to the north and east, there is an old trail leading down the mountain. 200 yards below the log barn, the narrow path finds a bench on a steep slope of the hillside, and at that level follows around the rim of the hollow, dipping a little at the head of the ravine east of the spring, then lifting itself over a low, heavily timbered spur on one of the higher hills. It comes out again into the open. Following a rocky ledge, the way farther on leads through a clump of sumac bushes and past the deer lick in the big low gaps, then around the base of Boulder Bald, along another ridge, and out on the bare shoulder of Dewey Bald, which partly shuts in the little valley on the south. From the big rock that Sammy Lane calls her lookout, the old trail leaves the rim of Mutton Hollow and slips easily down into the lower valleys, down past the little cabin on the southern slope of the mountain where Sammy lived with her father, down to the banks of Fall Creek, and to the distant river bottom. Here the thread-like path finds a wider way, leading somehow out of the wilderness to the great world that lies miles and miles beyond the farthest blue line of the hills. The world that Sammy said, quote, "seemed mighty fine to them that knowed nothing about it," unquote. No one seemed to know how long that narrow path had lain along the mountains, but it must have been a very long time, for it is deeply worn at places. Often in the years of our story, swift leaping deer would cross the ridge at the low gap and follow along the benches to the spring. And sometimes a lithe-bodied panther in a belt of timber watched hungrily for their coming. or a huge pawed catamount on some overhanging rock would lie in wait for fawn or doe. Or perhaps a gaunt timber wolf would sniff the trail, and with wild echoing howls call his comrades to the chase. Jim Lane, young then, followed that winding way from the distant river and from nobody knows where beyond when he came to build his lonely hunter's shack by the spring on the southern slope of the Dewey. And later, when the shack in the timber was replaced with a more substantial settler's cabin, Jim led Sammy's mother along the same old way. Then came the giant Grant Matthews with Aunt Molly and their little family. They followed the path 3 miles further and built their home where the trail climbs over the ridge. When Grant Matthews Jr. was 18, his father mortgaged the hard-worn homestead to purchase the sheep ranch in Mutton Hollow. Then it was that another path was made, branching off in the belt of timber from the old trail and following the spur down into the little valley where the corral was snugly sheltered from winter winds. So the Lane cabin, the Matthews homestead, and the sheep ranch in Mutton Hollow were all connected by well-marked paths. But it is the trail that leads from Sammy Lane's house to the big log house where young Matthews lives that is nobody knows how old. And that's the introduction. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 1, The Stranger. So, I hope you will enjoy this book. As I say, it was published in 1907 and looks to be quite interesting. So until next week, when we continue with Chapter 1, take care, stay safe, and God bless.